All right, welcome back everyone for another deep dive. We've got a really juicy topic to dig into today.
Oh yeah, this one's a classic. And a tricky one too.
You said it. We're going to be taking a look at a few different excerpts from ancient Egypt, Afrocentric and Eurocentric perspectives. The big question is, where did the ancient Egyptians come from?
Yeah, it's a question that people have been debating, like, forever.
Exactly. It's not exactly an open and shut case, right?
Yeah.
So before we get too far, why don't we lay it all out for our listeners? What kind of sources are we working with today, and what are we hoping to accomplish in this deep dive?
Well, like you mentioned, we've got these excerpts from ancient Egypt, Afrocentric, and Eurocentric perspectives. This book dives into some pretty hot debates about the origins of the ancient Egyptians. And, I mean, just saying the title out loud kind of tells you what we're getting into. We're going to be looking at two major schools of thought. The Afrocentric perspective, which emphasizes African origins, and the Eurocentric perspective, which, you guessed it, focuses on connections to Europe.
And we're going to try and untangle all of that, right?
Yeah, exactly. We're going to examine the evidence, the arguments, the whole shebang.
Great. Sounds good to me. So let's jump right in, shall we? Let's kick things off with the Afrocentric perspective. Our source mentions this guy, Cheikh Anta Diop, who argued pretty passionately that ancient Egypt was a black African civilization. Now, his work caused quite a stir, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Diop's work was, let's just say, it was controversial. He was challenging a lot of deeply held beliefs about ancient Egypt, particularly in the Western world.
Right. A lot of people weren't too happy with his ideas, were they?
Let's just say he ruffled some feathers in the academic world. You know, back then, the dominant view of ancient Egypt was very much influenced by European perspectives. And Diop's work, well, it kind of turned that on its head.
So what exactly was Diop arguing? What evidence did he use to back up his claims about the African roots of ancient Egypt?
Well, one of his most compelling arguments focused on the close cultural and historical links between ancient Egypt and Nubia, which is a region further south along the Nile River in what's now Sudan. He was looking at some pretty specific stuff, not just vague similarities.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Okay, so think about the pyramids, right? These monumental structures were built in both Egypt and Nubia. And it wasn't just the pyramids. There were also shared artistic motifs in their depictions of gods and goddesses. And then there's the whole language thing. Diop pointed out that there were some shared linguistic roots between ancient Egyptian and certain African languages spoken in the Nubian region.
Wow, that's pretty convincing. So, I mean, it's hard to dismiss those kinds of connections as mere coincidence.
Right, exactly. I mean, the evidence is pretty compelling.
All right, so we've got these strong arguments for African roots. But, you know, our source also presents a totally different viewpoint, the Eurocentric perspective. And there's even this theory called the dynastic race theory. It almost sounds like something out of an Indiana Jones movie, doesn't it?
Haha. Right. It does have a bit of a dramatic ring to it. The dynastic race theory basically proposed that sometime before the rise of the pharaohs, a group of people from Mesopotamia invaded Egypt and took over, establishing themselves as the ruling class.
Like a full-blown hostile takeover.
Yeah, pretty much. The folks who supported this theory pointed to things like skeletal structures and certain artifacts found in Egypt that they thought showed a clear Mesopotamian influence.
So they were looking for like physical and cultural clues to support this invasion theory.
Exactly. They thought they could trace the origins of the ancient Egyptians back to Mesopotamia by looking at their bones and the stuff they left behind.
Okay, that makes sense. But didn't this theory kind of fall out of favor? I mean, our source mentions that it's been largely rejected. What happened?
Yeah, well, as time went on and more research was done, a lot of those initial interpretations of the evidence were challenged. You know, archaeologists and historians started to question the assumptions behind the dynastic race theory. And frankly, it just didn't hold up under scrutiny.
Fascinating. So it's like, as we learn more, the story changes. The pieces of the puzzle shift around.
Exactly. It's all part of the process, right? Always questioning, always revising our understanding of the past.
Okay, so we've got Diop on one side, arguing for deep African roots. But then on the other side, you have some scholars claiming that ancient Egyptians were actually ancestors of modern-day Europeans. That seems like a pretty big leap, doesn't it?
It does, doesn't it? This argument often focuses on interpreting the physical features of people as depicted in ancient Egyptian art. They try to draw connections between those features and European populations.
But there's a problem with that, right? I mean, relying solely on artistic interpretations to determine someone's ancestry seems a bit, well, iffy.
It is. There are a few big issues with that approach. First of all, art, especially from that long ago, can be very stylized and symbolic. We can't always take those depictions as literal representations of what people actually looked like.
Right, it's like trying to figure out someone's ethnicity based on a caricature. You're not going to get a very accurate picture, are you?
Precisely. It's just not a reliable way to determine someone's ancestry.
So basically, relying on artistic interpretation alone can be really misleading.
Exactly. It's just one tiny piece of a much larger puzzle. And that puzzle becomes a lot clearer when we remember that ancient Egypt sat at a crossroads of trade and cultural exchange. They were on the Mediterranean, connected to Africa, the Near East, and beyond. They interacted with a ton of different people.
Right. They weren't exactly living in isolation.
Nope, not at all. And that's reflected in the archaeological evidence. We find a vibrant mix of influences from all these different cultures. We see it in their art, their religious practices, even down to the everyday objects they used. It's all there.
So what you're saying is ancient Egypt was more like a melting pot than a single homogeneous culture?
You got it. That's the key takeaway here.
Yeah.
Ancient Egypt was a dynamic civilization that changed and evolved over thousands of years. It was constantly interacting with and absorbing influences from its neighbors. Trying to shoehorn them into a single origin story just doesn't do justice to their complex history.
Wow, that's a really fascinating perspective. So the next time I see a picture of a pyramid or a pharaoh, I'm going to remember that it represents this incredibly diverse and vibrant culture, not just a static image from a textbook.
Exactly. Ancient Egypt is more than just tombs and monuments. It's a story of cultural exchange and human connection that spans millennia.
And that's a story worth diving into. So for all our listeners out there, maybe this deep dive has sparked your curiosity. Maybe you'll want to go check out Ancient Egypt, Afrocentric and Eurocentric perspectives yourselves. Who knows what other mysteries you might uncover?
You never know. There's always more to learn about ancient Egypt. It's a civilization that just keeps on giving.
That's right. And on that note, we'll wrap things up here. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll catch you next time.
See you then.